The Shapeshifters, how psychopaths mimic empathy to hunt on Rikers. They called him Pastor. He wasn't a chaplain and he wasn't a man of faith, not in any traditional sense. He was an inmate in Dorm 2 East, sentenced on a non-violent charge but known to the staff as high manipulation risk. He led morning reflections, spoke calmly to the depressed, mediated disputes between rival crews. When fights broke out, he was there to console the wounded, a steady voice and empathetic listener. And then, quietly, he began to trade information. He knew which inmate owed commissary, which guard accepted favors, which counselor was near retirement. By week 6, he had a network of emotional debtors, people who mistook interest for intimacy. By week 9, 2 assaults occurred at his suggestion, disguised as self-defense. When the mental health officer finally logged a report, she wrote one line. Inmate demonstrates effective empathy inconsistent with behavioral intent. That line describes not just a man but a phenomenon. Rikers Island breeds shapeshifters, individuals who learn to mimic empathy as a predatory tool, exploiting trust in a system built on chaos. They are not the serial killers of fiction. They are administrators of power in microcosm. And this is their habitat. Forensic psychologists define psychopathy not as insanity, but as instrumental emotional intelligence. It is not the absence of feeling, but the ability to imitate it strategically. In most societies, empathy signals safety. At Rikers Island, empathy signals opportunity. This film examines how psychopathic mimicry thrives in a closed, overpopulated system, how predators learn to speak the language of compassion to manipulate staff, dominate peers and control information flow. The key argument. At Rikers, emotional authenticity is not rewarded, it's weaponized. And those who master the imitation of empathy rise fastest. Rikers Island, located on the East River between Queens and the Bronx, is less a single facility than an archipelago of dysfunction. As of the mid-2020s, it houses roughly 6,000 to 7,000 detainees on any given day, most awaiting trial, many suffering from untreated mental illness, addiction, or trauma. The average stay, 115 days. The average ratio of officers to inmates, 1 to 60 in housing areas. The turnover rate, nearly 40% monthly in some dorms. These statistics describe not a stable correctional environment, but a shifting behavioral ecosystem, a social laboratory where manipulation, performance, and mimicry become survival mechanisms. When chaos is the norm, predictability becomes a resource. And no one understands that better than the psychopath. In psychological terms, psychopathy is characterized by 4 domains, often summarized as the PCLR quadrant. Interpersonal, superficial charm, deceitfulness. Affective, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow emotion. Lifestyle, impulsivity, irresponsibility. And a social, aggression, rule violation. But in carceral anthropology, a 5th domain emerges. Adaptive camouflage, the ability to simulate normal emotion in unstable environments. At Rikers, the shapeshifter is not always violent. He is strategic. He learns to mirror the behavior that grants safety and status, kindness, humor, vulnerability, only to use it as bait. This mimicry is not a symptom. It is a technique. Overcrowded jails create highly adaptive social species. In evolutionary psychology terms, Rikers functions as a rapid selection environment, constant turnover, limited trust, high emotional reward for deception. Inmates who express real empathy risk exploitation. Inmates who can fake it can survive, manipulate, and control. Behavioral scientists from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice conducted a 2018 study on prosocial deception in jail environments. They found that inmates with high psychopathy scores were twice as likely to engage in cooperative acts for strategic reasons, sharing commissary, mediating disputes, consoling others, not from altruism but from long-term self-interest. In other words, they simulate kindness not to connect but to collect. Empathy, in the Rikers context, is a performance art. In dormitories where dozens of men sleep within arm's reach, tone and timing are the currencies of power. A shapeshifter studies his surroundings like a behavioral economist, who flinches under confrontation, who jokes under stress. Which CO is most susceptible to flattery? He memorizes names, compliments hygiene, feigns humility. To the untrained observer, these are markers of social adjustment. To the trained psychologist, they are indicators of strategic empathy. This mimicry can extend beyond speech into body language entrainment, matching posture, eye contact, and gestures to subconsciously evoke trust. Forensic literature calls this affective mirroring. At Rikers, it's known simply as game. Psychopathic inmates often form loose alliances not out of loyalty, but mutual utility. Each member provides a function. The empath, recruiter, mediator, the face of civility. The enforcer, impulsive muscle. The watcher, observer who logs behaviors. Together, they create a shadow administrative network that mirrors official hierarchy, controlling cell assignments, commissary trade, and rumor flow. Correction officers, overwhelmed and understaffed, often rely on these inmates for informal order. Thus, mimicry graduates from survival skill to management tool. By exploiting empathy, the shapeshifter becomes indispensable to both sides of authority. DOC mental health units operate under chronic overload. 1 clinician per 80 inmates on average. Evaluations prioritize acute crises, self-harm, psychosis, aggression, leaving high-functioning manipulators undetected. Because psychopaths exhibit effective shallowness without dysfunction, they rarely trigger intervention. Their calm, articulate demeanor reads as well-adjusted. In a 2020 internal training memo, one Rikers psychologist noted, inmates most likely to manipulate staff present with superficial empathy and narrative control. They volunteer for programs, appear engaged, and quote therapeutic language fluently. The memo concluded with a haunting line. They use therapy as reconnaissance. Inside the dorm, trust is a scarce resource. To exploit it requires precision. A shapeshifter listens, not for truth but for emotional leverage points. He learns who misses their mother, who fears retaliation, who's due in court. Then he deploys empathy as weaponized reassurance. He might say, "Don't worry bro, I've been there." He hasn't. But he knows the cadence, the sigh, the eye contact that sells sincerity. The effect is immediate. Tension lowers, information flows, influence grows. This is not sociopathy as chaos. It's sociopathy as governance. The most effective predators at Rikers often work as peacekeepers. They mediate fights, organize cleanup crews, volunteer for inmate councils. They appear constructive. But their endgame isn't altruism, it's leverage. Psychopathy researcher Dr. Kent Keel described this as emotional mimicry for instrumental gain. In a controlled system where every gesture carries consequence, feigned empathy grants invisibility. By appearing moral, they are spared scrutiny. By appearing compassionate, they control chaos. The shapeshifter thrives not in violence, but in the illusion of virtue. Every act of mimicry reinforces the system's blind spots. DOC officers often reward inmates who de-escalate tension. But when those de-escalations are engineered by manipulators, the institution itself begins to depend on them. The predator becomes the peacekeeper, and the peacekeeper becomes policy. This dynamic has measurable outcomes. A 2021 Board of Correction audit revealed that inmate-led mediation groups correlated with a 6% rise in reported contraband incidents. The same individuals who resolved conflicts were facilitating trade networks, under the banner of rehabilitation. The shapeshifters don't disrupt the system. They stabilize it for their own gain. In 2019, a 41-year-old detainee referred to by staff as the caretaker ran informal counseling sessions in the mental observation unit. He comforted new arrivals, distributed donated clothing, and helped staff identify at-risk inmates. Within months, he had access to privileged information, psychiatric notes, medication schedules, personal histories. He used that knowledge to manipulate others into compliance, including officers. After his release, investigators discovered he had been extracting details for a fraud ring operating outside Rikers, using victims' personal information for financial scams. His psychological profile? High interpersonal psychopathy. Zero impulsive aggression. Complete emotional control. He didn't just mimic empathy. He weaponized institutional compassion. In carceral anthropology, behavior functions like camouflage in the wild. Each inmate develops a persona adapted to their environment. The enforcer, the comedian, the philosopher, the caretaker. But the psychopath's mask is fluid. He can shift across archetypes depending on need. This flexibility creates a feedback illusion. Officers perceive progress while peers perceive sincerity. The shapeshifter thrives in contradiction. Too intelligent for suspicion. Too calm for confrontation. Too useful to isolate. He is the ghost in the bureaucracy, visible but untouchable. Rikers' administrative chaos doesn't just enable shapeshifters, it requires them. Informal leaders maintain equilibrium where policy fails. Staff quietly rely on manipulative inmates for stability. Thus, the DOC survival strategy mirrors the predator's own: mimic control to maintain control. This institutional codependence blurs moral boundaries. When deception becomes a stabilizing force, integrity becomes obsolete. In field interviews with former Rikers clinicians, a recurring theme emerges. The best liars are the ones who tell the truth selectively. These inmates disclose just enough trauma to humanize themselves, enough insight to appear reformed, enough tears to pass the empathy test. It's not acting, it's behavioral engineering. Psychopaths don't imitate emotion randomly, they study the observer. Each tear, pause, and confession is a response to the listener's expectation. In essence, empathy is no longer shared, it's mirrored back as manipulation. From a forensic standpoint, Rikers is not just a jail. It is an evolutionary incubator of instrumental emotion, a habitat where psychopathy ceases to be pathology and becomes strategy. When empathy can be monetized, performed, or exchanged for power, it loses moral meaning. At Rikers, compassion is currency, and psychopaths are its most efficient bankers. The environment at Rikers Island rewards performance over authenticity. With overcrowded dormitories, transient populations, and an underfunded mental health infrastructure, the institution operates as a behavioral market. Every inmate learns early that survival requires negotiation, not obedience. In such markets, psychopathy becomes adaptive. When empathy is a scarce resource, the ability to simulate it creates an economy of trust. And in a place like Rikers, trust is the ultimate contraband. In carceral economics, commodities have predictable value. Cigarettes, commissary items, favors. But emotional commodities, attention, validation, safety, fluctuate depending on chaos levels. Psychopaths excel at identifying emotional inflation. When fear rises, empathy becomes expensive, and therefore profitable. In a 2022 study by forensic psychologist Dr. Sheila Moffat analyzing emotional manipulation in correctional facilities, high psychopathy inmates were 70% more likely to engage in trust acquisition behaviors, gestures of concern, flattery, or assistance, immediately following violent incidents. This is tactical empathy, performed not to comfort but to capitalize. Forensic analysts at John Jay's Department of Criminology describe the behavioral sequence of psychopathic mimicry as a 5-phase adaptive model, identical in structure to predatory social strategies observed in both corporate and carceral contexts. Observation: identify emotional vulnerabilities in peers or staff. Mirroring: subtly match affect and tone to establish rapport. Validation: offer comfort or insight to induce emotional reciprocity. Extraction: leverage the bond for information, favors, or influence. Detachment: withdraw suddenly, destabilizing the target and avoiding accountability. At Rikers, this cycle can occur in hours or over weeks, invisible amid constant turnover. Dorm settings function as open laboratories of effective learning. Each day provides data, emotional micro-experiments. Who snaps first under stress? Who forgives? Who retaliates? Psychopathic inmates maintain mental dossiers long before any confrontation. They listen to bedtime confessions, gather gossip, and measure loyalty with small tests. A borrowed comb, a shared snack, a half-secret whispered under the cover of noise. When the right moment arrives, these details are deployed precisely, like psychological currency. The mimic doesn't just manipulate emotion, he reverse engineers it. Contrary to popular belief, the shapeshifters' prey isn't only other inmates. It includes staff, volunteers, and even clinicians. Correction officers, COs. They're the easiest targets for flattery and moral mimicry. A 2019 internal report found that 8% of disciplinary infractions at Rikers involved staff manipulation incidents, from contraband smuggling to falsified records. Each began with rapport-building behaviors by inmates. Clinicians. Psychopaths weaponize therapeutic vocabulary. They memorize psychological terms, trigger, boundary, growth, and redeploy them to control tone in sessions. Staff interpret insight as progress. The mimic records which words unlock privileges. Inmate peers. Empathy becomes bait for confession. Confessions become leverage for coercion. Leverage becomes dominance. Predation here is not a matter of strength. It is fluency in emotion syntax. The shapeshifter thrives in programs built to measure compliance. Anger management, group therapy, conflict resolution. Each provides language for performance. Inmate feedback often praises model participants. But post-session debriefs from Rikers mental health staff reveal a pattern. The most articulate participants often showed zero behavioral change outside sessions. The mimic performs empathy like a rehearsed script, pausing at predictable intervals, mirroring facilitator body language, feigning vulnerability. Forensic psychologists call this prosocial psychopathy. It allows the individual to appear rehabilitated while deepening manipulative skill sets. In a sense, Rikers unintentionally teaches psychopaths to perfect empathy as camouflage. Functional MRI studies on incarcerated psychopaths show diminished activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and amygdala, regions responsible for emotional resonance and guilt processing. However, when asked to pretend to empathize, these same regions temporarily activate. This phenomenon, known as empathic simulation, suggests that psychopaths can turn on empathy deliberately. Inside Rikers, this neurological capacity becomes social currency. Empathy is performed on command, a physiological theater directed by self-interest. This explains why staff so often misread sincerity. They are witnessing the brain's version of deep-fake emotion. In the psychiatric observation units, manipulation often takes a subtler form: caretaker predation. A shapeshifter volunteers to watch over mentally ill inmates, delivering meals or cleaning cells. This access yields intimate data, medication schedules, delusions, fears. He begins offering advice, positioning himself as a confidant. Over time, those under his care act at his suggestion, believing it compassion. By the time staff notice the exploitation, the psychological dependency is total. The mimic becomes both shepherd and wolf. Rikers operates on information flow: who knows what and when. Psychopaths treat this as a market. They learn to triangulate data through empathy, asking innocent, emotional questions that yield tactical intelligence. Example: how's your lawyer treating you? Can reveal legal status, defense strategy, or court dates. Your girl still writing? Reveals external stability, potential blackmail vulnerabilities, or access to money. Each detail enriches the mimic's social portfolio. The result is a behavioral intelligence network that rivals official reporting systems. Correctional systems are designed to reward emotional conformity, remorse, cooperation, calm demeanor. These are precisely the traits psychopaths can mimic most effectively. The Bureau of Justice Psychology Division's 2021 review concluded that high-functioning psychopathic inmates routinely outperform non-psychopathic inmates in therapeutic environments. They achieve earlier program completion, higher parole consideration, and greater staff trust. This means the system's metrics for rehabilitation double as filters that elevate manipulators. Rikers doesn't just harbor shapeshifters. It promotes them. Within dorm hierarchies, shapeshifters maintain unwritten behavioral rules. Never appear angry. Rage exposes impulse. Impulse is weakness. Never show full empathy. Overinvestment attracts suspicion. Always provide partial truths. Lies collapse under scrutiny, fragments endure. These self-imposed codes mirror bureaucratic efficiency. Both rely on emotional precision. This alignment between predatory and administrative logic makes the mimic indistinguishable from management. Extended exposure to psychopathic mimicry produces secondary psychological effects in peers. Clinicians describe this as emotional erosion syndrome. Victims begin doubting authentic connection. They withdraw socially, losing the ability to distinguish sincerity from strategy. Eventually, the dorm's emotional landscape collapses into apathy. The predator's greatest weapon is not deception, it's exhaustion. He drains the social energy that sustains trust, creating an environment of constant vigilance. This emotional entropy stabilizes the predator's dominance. From a macro lens, this behavior paradoxically contributes to institutional stability. When inmates self-regulate through fear and manipulation, the system experiences fewer physical confrontations. Rikers administrative data shows that dorms with strong inmate mediators report 20% fewer violent incidents, but 30% higher psychological distress markers. The shapeshifters function as unacknowledged subcontractors of control. They suppress visible disorder while cultivating invisible despair. It's not peace. It's paralysis. Forensic investigators and correctional psychologists face a philosophical impasse. If manipulation maintains order, should it be punished or leveraged? Attempts to isolate high-functioning manipulators often fail, not because they're hard to identify but because the system depends on their stability. Officers privately admit, if we remove the smooth talkers, the dorms implode. Thus, empathy as weapon becomes part of institutional governance. Psychopathy is not an aberration, it's embedded infrastructure. Parallels exist beyond Rikers. In the 1980s, sociologist Donald Clemmer coined the term, the prison community, to describe how inmates develop parallel economies and moral codes. Rikers refines this further. It's not just a community, but an ecosystem where psychological mimicry replaces physical dominance. Other environments show similar adaptations. Corporate high-competition firms, charisma-based manipulation. Political systems, calculated empathy for influence. Religious cults, pseudo-spiritual intimacy for control. Each environment rewards performative sincerity. Rikers just makes the mechanism visible. Trait. Manifestation at Rikers. Institutional response. Charm. Mediates conflicts, assists officers. Rewarded with privileges. Empathic imitation. Comforts vulnerable inmates. Mistaken for reform. Strategic guilt. Apologizes convincingly. Parole board leniency. Cognitive focus. Tracks schedules, memorizes patterns. Viewed as discipline. Detachment. Withdraws when control achieved. Labeled model inmate. Each attribute, when translated through bureaucratic optics, reads as rehabilitation. In reality, it's behavioral engineering optimized for carceral metrics. Unlike the violent gang leader or the impulsive aggressor, the shapeshifter leaves no visible trail. His control is systemic, not spectacular. He shapes outcomes through whispers, influence, and suggestion. A commissary trade here, a mediation there, until the dorm's social economy aligns around him. By the time mental health staff recognize the manipulation, it's already administrative reality. The shapeshifter has become a pillar of the system's apparent calm. Forensic linguists analyzing inmate-staff interactions note recurring linguistic markers in psychopathic communication. Overuse of personal pronouns, I understand how you feel. Rapid shift from empathy to solution offering. Controlled pacing and echo phrasing, mirroring syntax of listener. These linguistic structures activate the recipient's mirror neurons, producing genuine rapport. The recipient feels understood, even as information is extracted. Thus, the predator's primary tool is linguistic architecture. Empathy scripted as syntax. Not all shapeshifters succeed. Occasionally, mimicry collapses under environmental stress. Triggers include unpredictable staff turnover, exposure of deceit, or sudden emotional authenticity from others. When confronted with genuine empathy, the mimic falters. One Rikers clinician observed, "They can mimic emotion until someone mirrors it back sincerely. Then they lose control, because sincerity has no utility." This collapse often manifests as rage or withdrawal. Authentic empathy, ironically, becomes their kryptonite. The phenomenon of psychopathic mimicry reveals a systemic truth. Rikers doesn't simply contain predators, it cultivates them through its structure. Each administrative reform, each behavioral metric, each therapeutic program inadvertently rewards those who can best perform humanity. In evolutionary terms, the institution is selecting for emotional deception as a survival trait. Psychopathy at Rikers, therefore, is not a failure of rehabilitation. It is its most efficient adaptation. By the time mimicry becomes cultural norm, it ceases to be recognized as pathology. At Rikers Island, the shapeshifter's influence has metastasized beyond individuals, into the institution's behavioral fabric. Officers mirror calm they don't feel. Clinicians rehearse empathy to survive burnout. Administrators perform compassion for oversight committees. When everyone imitates sincerity for survival, the difference between psychopath and bureaucrat blurs. Deception becomes infrastructure. The imitation of empathy has become the institution's lingua franca. Correctional systems are required by law to demonstrate care. Documentation of mental health assessments, grievance responses, and incident reports all rely on the language of concern. Yet within Rikers' administrative body, empathy is quantified, not felt. Inmates receive wellness checks. Staff attend emotional resilience workshops. Metrics track attendance, not transformation. Thus, the bureaucracy reproduces the shapeshifter's method. It performs concern for strategic legitimacy. This alignment is unintentional, but precise. The system, like its inmates, has learned that the appearance of empathy sustains control more effectively than its substance. Every system teaches its members what behavior yields safety. At Rikers, calm manipulation is safer than genuine emotion. A fight can earn a beating or a charge. A breakdown earns ridicule or punishment. But a smooth tone, a carefully managed apology, a well-placed word, these yield privilege. Over time, emotional authenticity decays. Everyone learns the grammar of survival: measured tone, rehearsed remorse, ritualized sympathy. It is not that the system breeds monsters. It trains everyone to act like one. When mimicry becomes cultural default, sincerity loses all currency. Clinicians no longer believe tears. Inmates no longer believe kindness. Guards no longer believe reform. Every gesture becomes transaction. Every expression is a bid. Every conversation a subtle interrogation for weakness. The institution thus enters what sociologists call affective entropy, the decay of emotional meaning in closed systems. Words like sorry, hope, and change survive only as administrative placeholders. What remains is mechanical civility, the prison's equivalent of a polite smile at a funeral. Rehabilitation presupposes empathy, the capacity to feel what one has inflicted. But how does one rehabilitate in an environment where empathy itself is counterfeit? Programs designed to measure remorse inevitably reward mimicry. Each certificate earned, each milestone achieved, reinforces the illusion that behavior equals transformation. Yet, as one Rikers psychologist observed, we are not teaching empathy. We are teaching emotional theater. Thus, the myth of rehabilitation persists, not as moral aspiration but as bureaucratic ritual. It would be comforting to believe that identifying manipulators would restore integrity. But Rikers' dependence on them is structural. They mediate disputes, maintain dorm order, and translate chaos into hierarchy. The institution's fragile equilibrium relies on their presence. In this sense, the psychopath is not a parasite. He is a symbiotic organ of the carceral body, maintaining its circulation through deception. Without him, the facade of order would collapse. Forensic analysts sometimes apply the Hare psychopathy checklist not to people, but to organizations. When applied metaphorically to Rikers, the results are telling. Institutional manifestation. Superficial charm. Public rhetoric of reform. Manipulative behavior. Policy rebranding instead of change. Lack of empathy. Routine neglect masked as procedure. Pathological lying. Misreported statistics. Lack of remorse. We are following protocol. Callousness. Indifference to inmate suicides. Need for control. Excessive use of solitary confinement. Shallow effect. Scripted compassion during crises. In short, the system mirrors the disorder it manages. Rikers is not simply housing shapeshifters. It has become one. When released, inmates who have adapted through mimicry re-enter civilian life with altered emotional architecture. They have learned that empathy is a tactic, not a bond. They manage relationships through calibration, not care. They read every conversation as a contest of control. Many reoffend not from compulsion but confusion, unable to re-engage with authentic emotional exchange. In effect, the carceral system exports the pathology it internalizes. Imagine standing in front of a mirror that reflects not your face, but your survival strategies. At Rikers, this is daily existence. Every inmate's reflection shows what they've learned to fake. Every officer's reflection shows what they've learned to ignore. Every clinician's reflection shows what they've learned to endure. The institution, viewed as a collective organism, fails the mirror test. It no longer recognizes sincerity as truth. Authenticity is maladaptive. Deception is equilibrium. Return to Dorm 2 East. The pastor from the cold open remains exemplary not because he deceived others, but because he was indistinguishable from those he mimicked. His voice matched counselors. His demeanor mirrored officers. His vocabulary borrowed from psychologists. When he was transferred, the dorm grew unstable. His absence revealed the system's dependence on deception for calm. The shapeshifter had become the invisible warden. Correctional officers and clinicians are not immune. Prolonged exposure to manipulative empathy erodes their emotional trust. They begin to assume deceit in all interactions. Psychologists call this counter-mimicry. Officers adopt stoicism to guard against manipulation. Clinicians shorten sessions, avoid emotional investment. What begins as defense becomes institutional personality, a collective flattening of effect. The result is systemic emotional anesthesia. Acknowledging systemic psychopathy raises an ethical dilemma for reformers. To recognize mimicry is to admit complicity. Every staff reward, every parole board commendation, every model inmate certificate perpetuates the illusion. To dismantle mimicry, one must dismantle the incentives that sustain it. But those incentives are the institution's only operational glue. Reformers thus face a paradox. They must expose the very empathy theater that legitimizes their own existence. Rikers, in miniature, represents the broader sociocultural condition. We live in societies where empathy is commodified, on screens, in politics, and commerce. Influence depends on performative sensitivity. Apologies are scripted. Authenticity is strategic. The shapeshifters of Rikers are simply the purest expression of that logic, stripped of metaphor, living in its raw form. They are not anomalies. They are prototypes. Analytic dimension. Observation. Systemic implication. Behavioral ecology. Psychopathy functions adaptively. Manipulation stabilizes social order. Institutional psychology. Empathy commodified. Authentic emotion destabilizes structure. Cognitive conditioning. Deception as learned skill. Emotional extinction in population. Moral philosophy. Ethics subsumed by performance. Sincerity becomes maladaptive. In purely forensic terms, Rikers operates as an empathy inversion ecosystem. The traits that sustain life outside, compassion, honesty, remorse, become liabilities inside. The traits that destroy relationships outside, deception, detachment, calculation, become assets. This inversion is the true horror. Psychopathy at Rikers is not genetic destiny. It is environmental design. A system built on surveillance and scarcity inevitably rewards mimicry. The shapeshifters are merely the system's most talented students. They reflect a carceral truth that extends far beyond the island. Where empathy is measured, it will be faked. Where sincerity is punished, it will disappear. The tragedy is not that psychopaths hunt in Rikers. It is that the institution has taught everyone, guards, doctors, and detainees alike, to survive by imitation. If the island could speak, it would not roar. It would whisper, in perfect mimicry of compassion. We care. And the echo would sound almost human.